While we all wish that we could load a full multi-layered VST into our Roland modules, that isn't possible. However, you can still improve your drum sounds with VST samples by using the one-shot sample import feature on your Roland TD-50, your Roland TD-27 or your TD-17. And to address a point that I can practically hear people screaming into their monitors right now,
one-shot samples don't give you good dynamics.
It is true to a degree. There's a trade-off when using one-shot samples in that you've got less variation, and it makes you more prone to getting that dreaded machine gunning effect. However, it's a huge exaggeration to suggest that it makes them unplayable, and if you get it right, I think that the improvement sonically is worth it. Most of the kits that I've created for my store have samples loaded to at least the snare drum head and rim, and I've had great feedback from people about the kits. This is likely to be because I've worked out what not to do with samples as much as I've worked out what to do with them. So I'm going to share these tips with you to help you maximize the effectiveness of your sample imports from any VSTs that you own. I'll be demonstrating everything on the computer side of things on Reaper. This is a digital audio workstation that is super affordable, and it even has a fully functioning unnerfed trial version that you could do all of this on. I won't be going into how to set up Reaper or how to install VSTs. This will be starting with the assumption that you've got VSTs installed and you know your way around a DAW to some degree. I'll try my best to explain these steps in a way that would be applicable to any DAW or software that you might be using. After we're done with the computer, we'll move over to the kit and I'll show you some examples on the TD-50 and the TD-17 modules, and I'll explain which parameters on the modules will lend themselves to getting the best results. The first thing that I think is important for blending samples on top of Roland sounds is to make sure that those samples are reasonably dry. One of the best things about using a VST is that ability to control all of the microphones and to dial in as much ambience as you want. And playing on a kit with a huge room is really fun with multi-layered samples. However, when you're working with one-shot samples, having a lot of ambience on that sample can actually be detrimental. When you have a lot of what I would call baked-in ambience on a sample and then you play that sample really fast over and over again, this will give you that machine gun effect that everybody's trying to avoid. The ambience on a one-shot sample doesn't blend between the hits like it would do on a VST, so you're going to get the exact same tone and level of ambience for every single hit, and it's that repetition of the exact same sound that gives you machine gunning. And this isn't to say that it can never sound good. I've used it myself on some kits for stylistic purposes, when I'm aiming for a particular sound, or even when I know that I'm going to be drenching that sample in on-board reverb or ambience too. So it does have its place, but for most applications you're going to want to keep the sample dry and then you can add in on-board ambience afterwards on your module. The module's ambience effects will be reacting to the sample, so it's going to sound a lot more organic, even if it doesn't quite sound as good as a VST's multi-sampled rooms. So here I've got Superior Drummer 2 loaded up, and I'm using a simple preset that I've made. I've made a MIDI track here to test it out, just a couple of snare hits to listen to it. And it sounds alright, but it's got quite a bit of room ambience on it. So if I go over to the mixer inside Superior Drummer 2, I can view the microphones that are active. When the snare plays, you can see that the ambience close, ambience mid and ambience far faders all jump up. They've all got snare coming into them and they're turned up quite a bit. So the simplest thing to do is just to hit mute on each one like this, and then listen again. So now it's pretty much just the snare microphones and the overhead mics. The overheads are adding just a little bit of ambience too, so I'm going to bring those down a touch. And I might just drop down the snare wires a bit with the bottom microphone too. Yeah, just a little bit more. Cool, this sounds decent enough and it shouldn't give us anything to worry about with baked-in ambience causing machine gunning. I've also got GetGood Drums Modern and Massive set up here and I'm using the Samurai preset, but it sounds very roomy. So once again we're going to find the appropriate faders and turn them off, and I'm also going to turn off this turbo mode because it's got lots of compression on it. The next thing that I think is really important is getting plenty of tone on your sample. Of course, attack and body are also going to be really important, especially on a module like a TD-17 where you don't get any control over the stock sample's transient settings. But on a TD-50 or a TD-27 that does have transient control, it's a little bit less important. So I've found that you need a good balance between tone and attack in order for it to work well with other Roland samples. If you've got too much attack and no tone, it won't really change up the character of the Roland snare that much, it'll just boost the attack. And if that's all you're going for, then that's great, but I think what most people are looking for when trying to use VST sounds like this is to replicate more of the character of the snare that's on the sample. And what I tend to find is that the top velocities on a lot of VSTs have a lot of attack, but they lose some of that tone. Sometimes you can tell that the drum's actually choking out because they're probably hitting it harder than they ever musically would do, just to sort of get that dynamic range on the sample bank. So your mileage will vary depending on the VST and the exact instrument that's being sampled, but I tend to find that anywhere between about 80 and 115 in the velocity range usually gets you a better balance of tone and attack. You can play around with the velocities to find the right balance for you. Bit much? Too soft? Cool, we'll go with 105, and then I'll do the same thing again but on modern and massive this time. So that one's really attack heavy, so we'll bring that one down. Not bad. No, a bit too much there. Way too soft. I think the sweet spot will be somewhere around here. There's a nice level of sustain, but it's not going too hard on the attack, and it's not choking the drum either. So now of course the volume is a little bit low, and that's the final aspect that we want to take care of before importing it into a Roland module. What I tend to find is that imported samples are quieter than the stock Roland sounds, and although you can push them up to +6 dB on the sub-instrument layer, if your sample is too quiet to begin with, it's not going to boost it enough. Boosting the entire instrument volume here isn't going to help you because that's also going to raise the volume of the stock sound. The best thing to use for this application, in my opinion, is a limiter. I usually use Ozone 5's Maximizer plugin, but I'll demo it with this MGA JS limiter because that comes with Reaper itself, and it has barely any settings, so it should easily translate across to other limiter plugins. And it's up to you whether you want to apply this effect straight to the track that you've got your VST on, or whether you'd rather export the file first and then bring it back into your DAW to apply the effect too. Either way can work fine, and I'll just apply it straight onto the VST track for speed and ease. So with limiting, what we're basically doing is trimming off some of the peak from the sample so that the rest of the sample's volume is louder comparatively. A hit of a drum, especially a snare, tends to have a very large initial transient, and then the rest is much quieter. The limiter will essentially clip the transient, and that brings up the volume of the remaining waveform. Different limiters will give you more control, and some will be really transparent, while others will be a bit more destructive and it'll sound clipped or distorted. And if you go too far, that will happen on pretty much any limiter. So here I'm going to bring the threshold down until enough limiting has been applied for me. This really depends how loud the VST or the sample is beforehand. Since my Superior Drummer 2 snare is only peaking at around -10 decibels, I'm going to need to take the threshold to at least -10 before it actually starts trimming the peak. Before this, all it's doing is bringing the volume up closer to 0 dB. So I'll go a little bit further. And this here still sounds pretty natural to me, but the volume has been raised significantly enough. You can see how much gain reduction is being applied to the transient on this little red meter. The release time I'm just going to leave as it is, as it's just a single hit that's short and sharp, so it's not making a significant difference that I can tell. And this ceiling setting here is basically where the output volume of the sample will cap out. -0.1 dB here is great as it won't clip on the Reaper track, and it also pretty much takes it up to the maximum volume possible. And then I'm going to export this file. The simplest way on Reaper is to make sure that the MIDI is lined up to a grid line, then make a time selection from the very beginning of the sample to where the playback of the sample ends. You'll have to listen to it or watch the track meter to work out where that is. So if I listen to this, it appears to end around here. So I'm happy with that time selection. And if you do want to play it safe, you can export it with some silence at the beginning and the end, and then re-import that new wave file into your project and trim it down yourself. Or you could even trim it down on your module if you want to, whichever way you find easiest. You don't want a chunk of silence at the beginning, as this means that the sample playback will be delayed, and you don't want a large amount of silence at the end either, as this will take up unnecessary space on your module. Now I'll go to File and Render, and I'll choose my output path. Give it a file name, and then you need to make sure that it's in the right format. The new Roland modules can take 16 or 24-bit stereo WAV files, whereas the SPD-SX can only take 16-bit. For a single hit that you're layering, I don't really see the need to go up to 24-bit, and that will also increase the file size, so I just blanket use 16-bit stereo with a sample rate of 44,100 Hz or 44.1 kHz. Hit render and it'll export your file. And then you just do this again for any other samples that you want, like toms, kicks, or other snares. So in my opinion, this is the best way to prep your samples to get them to a good volume to sound natural on a Roland module. Let's jump to the kit. So once you've loaded the samples to your module, there's a few things you want to do to get the best blending possible. First, you want to make sure that the samples are on the correct play mode. On the current Roland modules, there are one-shot mono, one-shot poly, and loop alt settings. You want to be in the one-shot poly mode for most sample layering applications. This means that when you hit the same pad multiple times, the sample will still ring out from the last time you hit it. In mono mode, every successive hit will cancel out the last played version of that sample. We don't want that to happen if we want it to sound more natural. There's some situations where you might have a long sustaining deep bass sample like a kick drum where you do want this to happen, but in most applications you're going to want the poly mode. After this, we want to pick an internal sound to layer our sample on top of. You want to try your best to avoid tuning conflicts between the stock sample and your imported sample. This will allow the sound to be much more cohesive. A really high-pitched stock sample with a low-pitched snare on top might sound kind of cool, but it won't sound natural if that's what you're going for. If your module has dampening options and things like snare wire control, you're probably going to want to utilize these functions while you're layering. Personally, I try to start out as dry as possible and then I'll dial these parameters back in as I see fit. So I might muffle the Roland sample quite a bit and I'll take the snare wires completely down. And then if it feels like you want to add a bit more sustain or a bit more snare wire, you can do that. Like with the VST samples, I find that keeping them drier to begin with works better, as it allows you to focus on things like the tuning rather than worrying about overtone conflicts and other things like that. On the TD-50, I personally find that the walnut popper snare is the best one to get to grips with sample layering. It's really easy to get that particular snare very dry, and I've got another video specifically on that if you want to go check it out after this one. On the TD-17, I found the best results with the maple snare or the maple piccolo snare. Once again, that's really easy to get it to sound quite dry and fit nicely underneath other samples. Or the mahogany snare is another good one for layering, but you have to be a lot more mindful of tuning and dampening with that particular snare. Having not used a TD-27 yet, unfortunately I can't recommend any specifics for that module. Of course, once you get used to these parameters and depending on the sample that you import, you'll be able to get many of the other stock sounds to work very well, but these are the ones that I find are best to start with. When it comes to kick drums, I find them a lot more lenient, and when it comes to toms, again, I would say start by dampening them quite heavily, try and get the pitch of the attack and your sample to line up quite well, and then start dialing back some resonance in if you want it or if you think it works. And then finally, you want to add your sample as the sub-instrument layer and choose the appropriate layer type for the sample. You can choose between mixing the sample, fading the sample, and switching the sample at a particular point. Personally, I pretty much universally use the Fade 3 function on the TD-50 or the Fade 2 function on the TD-17. For some reason, there's only 2 fades on the 17, but there's 3 on the 50. But basically, I aim for whichever fade option gives me the most gradual fade. And then from here, you can pick which point the sample starts to fade in. You'll probably need to dial this into taste, and it will depend on the exact sample that you're using. Some are going to work better fading in lower, some are going to work better fading in higher. But I tend to start somewhere around around 40 and then go from there. This means that the sample will slowly start blending in once you get past your ghost note range. If the sample you're using has quite a lot of attack, this will be especially important because all that attack will ruin your ghost notes. And that's why the muffling, the tuning, the fade type and the fade in point are all very important. You want to get them all working together to sound as natural as possible as you go up in dynamics. So I'm going to show you how those samples I exported before sound on both the 50 and the 17. I'll also demonstrate some samples with baked-in ambience like I talked about earlier. That way you can decide for yourself whether you think it sounds artificial, machine gunny or natural or even stylistically appropriate or not. I'll also go through some other samples that I've exported from different VSTs, other drum modules and my own recording sessions. Of course, if this all seems a bit too complicated, or you're not exactly sure where to start, or heck, even if you just want to see how the rest of a kit is built around a sample, the kits over on my store at thedrumworkshop.com are very reasonably priced, and you can buy them in full packs or individually. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this, pop a like on it if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to share it with anybody that you think might find it useful. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!